Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Security Space podcast. Today we are joined by Jack Wright, and what we will be discussing is leadership versus management in cybersecurity and how lessons from the military can actually cross-pollinate over into the corporate world. The reason being is that obviously a common phrase used is from the battlefield to the boardroom when we are discussing this journey. And what we seem to notice is that leadership is universal, but management is actually contextual. So in cyber, the ability to inspire and be direct is just as critical as operational expertise as well. So obviously, that being said, when does a military leadership approach actually thrive in the corporate environment and when can it backfire? So as mentioned, Jack Wright is our guest today. And Jack, I'll pass over to yourself just to give a quick introduction to yourself, if that's okay, mate.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Jack Wright. I head up cyber resilience for Allianz UK, the insurance company. Worked in many varied places. I feel like I hit an 18-month limit at a job and then I soon bounce around. But my background traditionally is a building surveyor, but then I moved over to the British Army as a military police officer, mostly in sort of training establishments and then operations and training. Following that, I got quite fortunate to do my close protection course, so deployed out to North Africa for over the COVID period. So all of COVID, I missed, enjoying the complete absence of lockdown. And then after that, worked at 77 Brigade doing information operations and doing a lot of liaison with our sort of partners across government there. Instead of being dragged up to Scotland, which my partner at the time then really didn't want to do, I thought I'd make a sensible lateral move out of the British Army, sort of leveraging the best jobs that you have, right? So you've developed over 7 or 8 years at that point, all the sort of leadership and management training that you're probably going to get, sort of thing. You're tweaking after that point. And I thought, well, where can I work sensibly afterwards? I think a lot of people, when you leave the military, you're trying to work out, well, what's like a one-for-one comparison between the jobs I used to do? What am I qualified to do now? And contrary to how viscerally I feel, I want to dedicate all my time and effort to hard skills. Actually, all the teachers and all the training saying that soft skills are the most important thing actually ended up being right. Which is emotionally devastating for me. But yeah, the skills that are really hard to quantify are the ones that are most prized anywhere else. So I've worked now in the afterwards I worked in the both government, so public and private sector, and they are both equally required. Both equally require the skills that almost everyone who has served, even whether you serve in the RAF or the Navy or the Army, all have need of leadership and management skills. And we'll cover a bit more both about the distinctions, but actually also the necessity of both. So after that, I left, worked bounced in a few different government departments, mostly in physical security and incident management, and then moved over more recently now to cyber incident management and that sort of resiliency space in the private sector. So yeah, had a few jobs. 18 months is sort of capping out at my most sort of. So I'm halfway through that tenure now. So we'll see where it goes. But yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Brilliant, brilliant. And just for the benefit of the audience, Jack has very much done the high level there. Like when we were catching up before this pod, actually getting into the nuts and bolts of what each and every role that he's done is very interesting. So if you get a chance to grab Jack in his very, very busy time, he's definitely one to have a chat with. So to jump in on this one then, I suppose let's do it from a helicopter overview. Leadership in the military then, how does it actually differ to cybersecurity teams then as a higher level overview?
So the advantage that the military has is that at the end of the day, the sort of the worst case scenario is always a loss of life, right? They manifest in various ways, but you always have that critical function that you're like, look, we need to avoid this thing, and you can go into any operational room and say, look, there's this risk of life, and it means something. It carries weight, and that's why empowerment is so important in the military, because what you're always trying to do, I think the phrase they used to use, sort of like a strategic soldier or a strategic corporal or something. But the idea being is that anyone can have this strategic impact. You maybe won't realize it at the time, but your actions are extremely powerful. So when you're in the military, you're always thinking, well, actually, if something affects the quality of life, if somebody could be affected, then you're going to be empowered and you're going to be trusted to make something to prevent that taking place. In almost all government, except sort of first responder roles, and in the private sector as well, your roles are so abstract, you're so removed from the front line, the operational effect, that it's hard to say, well, somebody's going to die. So oftentimes you think most people don't feel very empowered at all. Even if you have a cybersecurity incident, it's hard to say, well, actually, someone's going to die, because you're possibly going to lose, like, even if you lost £500,000 worth of revenue, it's only money, right? And you've got insurance and you've got things that support that, and you've got business continuity plans. So the real struggle is that leadership is front and foremost in the military, because you've got this life or death risk. And then in the sort of regular life, you genuinely or generally don't have that sort of life or death risk. And so actually leadership is almost quite difficult to convince people to do. I think, are you familiar with LARPing, live action role playing?
No, but I feel like you could talk me through it.
So the phrase, like, if somebody's LARPing, they're pretending to be something that they're not, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so generally, I almost feel now, like, my experience is that most people are in fact LARPing at leadership.
Yep.
If you're even to extent, the military does it when they're not on operations, right? So when you're in operations, everyone is serious and everyone understands the risks, and that's when leadership really matters. And I think we actually do it really well now. But actually, in the private sector, people like the idea of leadership, which means being inspirational, leading from the front. It's really an emotion-driven way of operating. And partly because we're British, we've got a very reserved sense of not wanting to put ourselves out there. We don't really like leading by personality. We sort of want to lead by, like, process. We think of that as more scientific. So when you imagine management, you've got your management styles. This is your weekly meetings and leave and things that are all conventional. And we sort of like those. But leadership is very much emotion driven. Love him or hate him, Trump is a leader in that sense, because he's emotionally driven, and he drives around, he inspires people to do things. But there's this really interesting dynamic now where I've seen a lot of leadership training from different government departments and private organizations, and all of it falls short. None of it feels convincing. And I think it's because at the end of the day, just like we started with, we can't justify or convince that it's really life or death. And so we always cringe a little bit when we see it. We're like, it feels so unnatural. And then you see people doing it, and I think no one's convinced by corporate leadership, because you say things and you're like, you don't really mean it. And we'll all sit in meetings and people will say things, this is what it means to be a leader, and you think, no, this isn't what it means to be a leader. So one of the biggest challenges that people have when they leave the military is thinking, well, look, I have this unique skill set about leadership, and you absolutely do. And you think, I can probably pull this great leadership where I care about my team, I care about the outcomes, but really you're going to struggle, because actually you don't have the underpinning requirement for leadership. Contrary to what people will want to say, you don't have the life or death situation where that leadership can really add value. And so actually I'm almost now moving away from this fully, often in the military they say, don't worry about management, just focus on leadership sort of thing. Well, now actually the trouble that unless you're in a few sectors about, like, incident management, where you need to be a strong leader and you need to pull people together, oftentimes you want to recognize you have this great leadership skill and use it where you can, but try not to make it your sole personality. You need to recognize the management styles and the processes of the organizations that you're working in, because oftentimes for non-military jobs, those are actually more important.
So to come in on that, Jack, how would a non-military leader then express across to his team significance and urgency? Because, like you say, they don't have that experience in a life or death situation, but they are responsible for the business needs. So how can they get across the urgency and significance of, securing the infrastructure of the organization in a non-cringe way?
With great difficulty. I mean, I would say generally they don't do it well.
Okay.
And they don't do it well because the leadership training that they receive is
Hmm.
often from people who have never led.
Okay.
So the brilliant advantage you have in the military is that you have your hierarchy, you have your structure, and oftentimes your sort of phase one, phase two leaders who teach you how to be a soldier or how to be an officer or whatever role you're in. They're often people who have done things. They have done operational tours where that leadership has been required.
Yep.
Corporate leadership programs, the government leadership programs are more like facsimiles of leadership. They are what we think leadership should look like.
Yep.
So then when people try to implement them, they don't come across as authentic. They come across as people thinking this is what leadership is supposed to look like. So if you are non-military and you're trying to be more of a leader, or you really want to just sort of forget everything that an organization has taught you and just imagine yourself as the person who you're speaking to and say,
Yep.
what would this person need? What would they require? And that's much harder to do because oftentimes we want a schema or something to copy and emulate, but
Yep.
without real experience, you're just not going to get it, sort of thing.
So
So
to take it one step back, Jack, what is the difference between leadership and management?
yeah, probably probably where we should have started, and a hotly contested topic from academia, sort of thing. Um, there's so many different definitions about what it is, but I genuinely don't think it needs to be as complicated as people make out. Really, management is about processes, it's about structure, and it's sort of it's the non-human element, right? It's the flow of information in a purely sort of in a structured, non-emotional sense, and then leadership is everything that is sort of socio-emotional, right? It's the way in which people inspire activity by virtue of their character,
Yeah.
where management is creating action almost by virtue of like authority,
Yeah.
right? So if you have a process that says here's the way A to B to C, you're doing it because the process, this sort of vague authority, says this is the way you do it. You know, if you follow lines in a car park, you're being managed. But if there's someone who says, "Hey, come this way," sort of thing, there's loads of parking, sort of thing, you're more looking at leadership, right? So there's loads of academic complexity around it, and so many people have written essays on the difference. But
Mm.
really, leadership is emotionally charged, and neither's good or bad. They're just different mechanisms of enacting action.
Yeah. I think because I always try and understand things via my own analogies and well, so does everybody. But I think the way you described it, then I was like, my mind actually went to sort of a captain of a football team and then the manager of a football team, and it just brought back to 2005 when the Liverpool Champions League, and Gerrard told the manager to stay out of the dressing room so that he can deliver the team talk.
Yeah,
It's like whilst Benitez can set up the formation, it's everything the structure, the tactics, the substitutions, the lineup. Gerard came in at half time and went, "You stay out. I want to speak to him." And it's like the emotional drivers. It's the fact that I'm in the trenches with you.
yeah.
You can speak to me, whatever's going on. You tell me right now, because I'll bleed for this club and everything like that. So it's like the passionate side. It's exactly what you were saying about the emotional side. So, and I suppose good leaders need to be both, don't they? An excellent leader. They've been through the trenches and have now come into a managerial position, which is why I think those that there's why there's whole questions around the technical seesaw versus the non-technical seesaw, and that's a whole other sort of topic that we can go down that we won't do because we'll save that for another day. But it's yeah,
Well,
it can go
there's
either
more
way.
information on that now. I read a paper the other week actually that they're talking about CISOs becoming more like a legal role. So
Yeah,
you're seeing a lot of evidence about, or a lot of work around people trying to quantify cybersecurity risk. And in fact, for most organizations, even where you can do it, it's so challenging to do
mm,
that, we use like 5 by 5 grids, don't we, for risk registers? You've got your impact and your likelihood. But actually, most people, it's there's so many assumptions and estimates made that normally now they're talking about where we would say here's this 5 by 5 grid.
yep,
If you put it into like legalese, actually it's more about like what's reasonable. And if you think about it from like a policing perspective, it's on the balance of probabilities, did you take reasonable precautions? It's much more about governance, it's much more about regulation. And so this narrative driven CISO from a legal perspective is becoming more prevalent because it's about what story, how can you compel people to take the actions. Most breaches now are caused by third parties, they're caused by
yep,
social engineering. And so actually, people want to always move towards, especially technical people, always want to move this more academic, technical, quantified. But then, how much of that quantification is really valid? Really, really difficult. It's a really interesting area. It could probably fill another couple of
Yeah,
podcasts.
no, absolutely. It is interesting. The role of the seesaw is definitely moving. I don't know where, but like you say, if it's more legal, yeah, it could be. So yeah, obviously, just to move it forward a little bit then. There's obviously a place for military leadership in the corporate world, and it is happened a lot. I know not a lot of people that, including yourself, Jack, that are in sort of leadership positions that have got an ex-mil background. But where doesn't it work? Where have you actually had experience where like, oh, okay, my approach is a little bit different to this person. This person does not respond well to my style of leadership. And there's so many different types of leadership and there's testaments of success to all sorts. But where do you sort of see it becoming a bit unstuck, like this person it's not right for?
Yeah, really interesting question. There's two parts in my mind that I want to jump to. So, during the Second World War, Churchill was a wartime leader, right? And as soon as the Second World War was over, they binned him off. There is a time and a place for the skills that you've developed, and they're incredibly valuable. But don't assume that it is the right answer for all circumstances. It's the right answer for certain circumstances. So, I work in incident management where at the point at which crisis occurs, now you just need things to be fixed. And I can more justifiably get away with a brash, straightforward approach that is solution orientated in most other jobs, even if you take on project manager roles, which are pretty common, well taken up by ex-military people, the extent and expectation of collaboration across the private sector and public sector, really just non-military, is much greater. And you can find yourself starting to get into a little bit of trouble if your expectations aren't quite aligned, sort of thing. So I would say you've got two options. Either you realize that you love the way of leading and managing people in the style in which you learned in the military, and you can double down on that and go into roles. So incident management, you can work in SOCs and do anything where you're more threat focused. Even the threat intelligence roles are quite outcome driven. So you can work into those and you can bring that personality and you can pretty much take it one for one. People look at the roles and the experience people have in the military and they like those characters. That's why they employ people into those roles. And some project and program manager roles are similar.
Yeah.
But if you try to take a sort of a more technical role, you'll still have that old experience and way of operating, and you can find it quite difficult to mesh in, sort of thing. So I've worked with a few people who have gone straight out of the military, and then a lot of people have worked who left 10, 15 years ago. And you do find, if you've been that institutionalized that it's still in you 15 years later, you will find yourself career limited or sector limited. Yep. Because people will struggle to integrate with you. You've got to remember 99% of people haven't gone what you've gone through. Even if you didn't deploy in operations, you've still gone through that training and you still believe that this is the right way of doing things. So it's really about recognizing that the way in which you've learned to lead is really effective in some circumstances. If you want to maintain it, identify circumstances where you can lead in that way. And if you want to look at a new way of operating and leading and managing people, then look for similar roles that are a step removed, right? So if you move into a security role that's not incident focused, you can start transitioning through into other styles. And it's your choice. I think we used to get told you want to focus on your weaknesses and bring them up. But I think actually the evidence suggests now that it's much more effective for you to recognize your strengths and double down on them. Because if you're always paying attention to your weaknesses, you're just middling in them. You're just middling, right? But what you want to do is you want to be an expert at something, and if you've got any critical failings, fine, want to bring them up. But try to deliver leadership and management in an authentic way, the way that you like. And if that happens to align to the military, then maybe find a public sector job that is somewhat akin. Otherwise, you might find your first 12 to 24 months is a bit disjointed whilst you come out. But you won't know what the right teams are until you go into it, sort of thing. So it's as much about using those interview times to grill the people you're being interviewed by and say, look, what leadership style are you looking for? I can add lots of value in this space if that's something that you're interested in. And if it's not, then recognize it's probably a limited area for you and maybe look elsewhere.
Absolutely. So how important would you say emotional intelligence is when it comes to this sort of role?
I would say hugely. It's so much more important out of the military because you don't have that underpinning authority to direct action. You can't say, "Hang on, someone's going to die. You need to crack on and do this thing." Instead, emotional intelligence now is by far the most important skill. And within cybersecurity and IT, it's even more valuable because people generally join IT and cybersecurity because they're quite technically focused. They like the puzzle solving elements of it. But we're finding now that actually, once a baseline of security controls are in place, increasingly you're really managing the human element.
Mm.
You're managing different stakeholders, you're managing different ways of doing things. And that emotional intelligence, as much as I fight against it internally, is definitely it's sort of your battle winning asset is if you can pull that in because you've got this authenticity, you've got this credibility behind you from your experience. And then if you can be smart enough to refine it and to say, look, here's where I'm going to use this strength. And otherwise, I'm going to need to bring certain people along because whilst you can yell at some people to bring them along, other people, they do need a helping hand. And your job is to get the best out of your teams, whether they're directly line managed by you or not. So emotional intelligence is really, really important. And the only way you're going to develop it is if you have an intrinsic want to help people in that space. So I don't think there's any courses or training that you can really receive about like building empathy and developing like a different mindset. But if you just recognize it's effective, and that is why you should do it when you think it's suitable. But remember, that a lot of people only have emotional intelligence and they don't have any practical intelligence. So you're always balancing people who are really good at managing people and then other people who are not good at getting anything done. And a big strength that you have is that military people can come along and they can get stuff done. And that has big strengths. I think that's why so many military people become contractors or consultants, because any company can get them in, give them a clearly defined product and say, look, I need this from you. And most cybersecurity problems have a one-to-one mapping for physical security problems. So whilst they obfuscate the language and make you think cybersecurity is really challenging, and certainly there are very technical elements to it, you can learn all of it. And you probably intrinsically understand the principles if you just compared it to a house or a town or a village and you imagine it in that sense. So, whilst you don't have the same technical knowledge that people who have done 5 years in cybersecurity direct out of university have, you have a approach that is almost unlearnable for those people who have come straight out of university. So, and leverage that skills that you do have to get stuff done and to drive change. Don't double down on your weakness, which is to focus on the technical stuff. You could do that, but just pull that up to a baseline where you're functioning and then use that great skill set, all that leadership training that you've received. And that's probably the easiest way for you. Certainly it's the quickest way.
Absolutely. No, it's a really fantastic point. And I wanted to bring it back to what you were saying there about the it's hard to measure and it's like, it's very qualitative, it's very subjective, it's these leadership styles and but when it comes to a need to be objective about it, i.e. job interviews, how do you actually get across and sell your military leadership style in the corporate world? Because like you say, it's all well and good saying, yeah, I've got this military leadership style, but how do you actually present that? Do you know what I mean? In a 30-minute face-to-face interview.
Yeah, so there's I can't remember whose term it is, but sense making, right? It's about the story and the narrative that you create around it. So most people don't have any understanding as to what you've done. Writing CVs, ex-military CVs into the private space is difficult enough, but they have an expectation of an idea as to what your experiences are. Your job in an interview is to sell yourself as a character, right? You've passed the CV sift. That's the technical stuff. That says, I think you're broadly good enough. In most interviews, they're now just looking, do I like you? Do you present as the way I want to see? And do I think you're going to solve the problems that I want you to solve within my team? And the best way you can do that is just by having 2 or 3 examples of times which you've stepped up or contributed to something. And they want to see you as a human. The more you can share in an interview, the better you are. Don't try and learn by rote and just go through in a methodical way. Just be a human. And that's what people want to see. So, don't think like, okay, I've got to follow the STAR format: situation, task, action, result sort of thing. That's good. It's a handrail, especially if you're going for civil service jobs. You have to do that. But if you're specifically pitching leadership, They want to see your ability to lead in that interview. And that's going to be by being confident, projecting yourself and saying, look, these are the things that matter. And sometimes they want to see a little bit of robustness, but not too much. So they want to see that you can demonstrate you can get things done, but then give them the corporate conciliation and support and emotional intelligence that they also want to see, because you have to function. So they want a bit of leadership. Great. Here's some examples. If you've got any war stories, something moderate and not too on the nose is appropriate sort of thing. They don't need gory details because everyone's seen Band of Brothers. They've got an idea for what you do. It doesn't need to be real because they'll have created a story in their mind. So you're just using your real experiences, making it appropriate for the audience. So you want to think of it as like maybe a 12 rated movie. You know, it's not an 18. There might be an adult and they might be emotionally impressed by your story, but you're also demonstrating professionalism. And you're trying to say, look, here is a 12 version of the story sort of thing. Somebody was harmed. There was a danger. And avoid all technical language, because if you don't impress anyone with it, it just confuses things. So you want to make it. Alex Hormozy did a really interesting, he's like a business guru guy, if people aren't aware. He did a really interesting thing talking about everything he says, he wants to make it understandable for effectively a child, right? So if he ever catches himself using a word, like I said, obfuscate earlier, and I held myself back on it, you should say exactly the words in the simplest terms you should at all times, sort of thing. So when you're in your interview, just translate your real experiences as a human. Don't try and use your technical military terms because it just doesn't add any value for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of someone who works for a completely ex-mil organization, the amount of times they're speaking in acronyms, where I'm just like, you're gonna have to just go back to the start here, and we waste time doing it. Um, Perfect. Last question for you, Jack. More than anything, it's been a terrific pod, and just want to ask you, what are some things that you've brought over from the military time where you're like, they might have even just been like maybe 6 out of 10s in terms of like your priorities, skills at the time in the military world that have been like, oh wow, these are actually they massively correlate to the corporate world now. And also, what are some things that you're just like, oh, I tried that, that does not work. That's a military exclusive skill set that stays at the door there. Yeah, that's just my last couple of questions for you, mate.
Yeah, it's the basics. It's the basics that you won't have even realized are basics. Things like respecting your team's time. Okay, the amount of meetings people in non-military space, people have meetings for the sake of having meetings because they think being busy is being effective. But there is a huge difference between being effective, which is delivering your outcomes, versus running around madly. You'll always employ someone who can move 2 tons of soil in your back garden in 12 hours and use a digger over somebody who takes 2 weeks digging it by hand. You don't care how hard somebody works, you care about the outcomes. And the military teaches you that. Even though you'd think, oh, the private sector is really good at managing, right, but it's not good at leading, it's generally pretty poor at both, right? So when you the things you want to bring over, weekly meetings where you cover the basics. So things like, what leave do people have? What courses do they want? In the military, looking after your team is your first job, and then whatever your cat badge is, your skill is your second job. In the private sector, it's the other way around, right? People barely touch any time on managing their people. So if you can be a good manager, and don't worry too much about managing or leadership, you can manage people and look after people well if you just prioritize them. So manage their leave, manage their courses, understand where they want to go. Things like end of year reports, quarterly reports, perform personal development plans. Those things you just assumed are basic in the military. They are not done outside of the military, and people barely have a passing awareness of it. So you can keep it really simple. Those things, those structures, when you lead by example, is definitely a big one, because if you think people are wasting time in meetings, just make it clear. Those meetings are a waste of time. I don't attend them, and I support you in any meetings you say are not worth your time. If you don't want to attend a meeting, don't attend it, and you can say I said so, right? Backing your team is absolutely the best thing the leadership has ever taught you. Having the confidence to do so makes a really big difference.
Having the ability to say no as well, isn't it? That's a
Yeah.
big leadership trait. Yeah.
Yeah. And being able to say no in a somewhat tactful way is helpful. But I would say non-essential, right? I think the difference is military leaders take accountability. They take personal responsibility for everything under them. That's less so the case as a general rule. You get brilliant leaders everywhere. But as a general, if you've got the skill set, that is something you can pretty much rip one for one when you come over and say, look, here's where the weekly meetings are. I'm only keeping you for the bare bones. Don't brief on everything you know, just brief on the essentials. Everything you learn in the military, that's good. That's gold stuff. In terms of things you don't want to bring over, probably try and tone down the confidence. It's very overbearing for normal people. And unless you're willing to commit to it and put yourself in sectors and jobs where it is essential and people will put up with you, it's probably just not in your best interest to do. So whilst that confidence is everything and that leadership is everything in the military, in the private sector, it is a collaborative space. And that, it can afford to be because it's not life or death in most instances. So it's more important for you to navigate ideas, develop a social understanding, and the politics is extremely important out of the military because you're trying to understand who has the power at what point, and it's about gently moving things around. Allow your aura and your experience to speak for itself. Be quietly confident and get things done. Don't try to be the brash, extremely overconfident PTI corporal who everyone loves, but potentially people don't take quite as serious as they should, sort of thing. So yeah, there's lots of backs and forth. It all depends on your circumstance. So just be willing to change and you'll be okay. The skill sets and character that you developed, they carry all the way. They do a lot of things. You've already got the right answers in your mind. So just give it a bit of time and don't rush, which I definitely do.
Perfect. Jack, you've been absolutely fantastic. So if anybody has any questions for Jack, what he's raised today, I'll be sure to put his information down below. But once again, mate, thank you very much for coming on the Security Space podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for the time, Nick. Nice to meet you.